Late one Sunday afternoon in May 1863, Professor Lidenbrock came home early. He was looking at an old book. It was a fantastic book. It's more than 600 years old. A piece of parchment fell out of the book. He could not read it because it was written in a secret code and the letters were mixed up. He looked puzzled. When he was puzzled, he usually became angry. The professor guessed that the message was written in Latin and not Icelandic. Scientists of the 16th century always wrote about their discoveries in Latin. He hit his desk with his fist. Then he left home. Axel picked up the parchment and studied it. He tried to arrange the letters so that they formed Latin words. But it was impossible. He tried every combination of letters he could think of, but he still couldn't make any sense of it. While he was sitting in front of the window, he saw some Latin words which he knew: Pretrem, a crater, terrestre, of the earth. Axel had broken the secret code. But he didn't want to tell his uncle because his uncle would want to make that dangerous journey and would take Axel with him. The professor studied the parchment all night, but he couldn't read it. Axel told him the secret code because he felt sorry about him. The messages go down into the crater of Sneffels, which the shadow of Scartaris touches before July. Then you will reach the center of the earth. I have done this. Arne Saknussemm. In Atlas, the professor showed Axel the places Arne had written about on the map of Iceland. Sneffels is an extinct volcano. It has not erupted since the year 1229. The professor decided to leave for Iceland the day after tomorrow. They prepared guns, tools, and scientific instruments and were packed into boxes. They traveled by a steamer to Copenhagen. In Copenhagen they met a Danish scientist who gave them letters of introduction to the most important men in Iceland. In Iceland they met Dr. Fredriksson. He was very helpful. He arranged for a guide called Hans to take them to Sneffels. They loved Hans because he was a big man who moved slowly and didn't say very much. They followed a path along the coast. The countryside was bleak. There were no crops and hardly any animals. The grass was yellow and there were large rocks everywhere. Here and there they saw a lonely farmhouse. After 3 more days they reached the base of Sneffels. They climbed Sneffels for the whole of the next day. The crater of Sneffels was shaped like an ice cream cone. At the bottom of the crater there were 3 chimneys. There was no shadow because there was no sun. The professor gave a shout while he was exploring 3 chimneys because he saw some marks on a large rock. They were letters and they spelled the name of Arne Saknussemm. For 3 days clouds covered the sun. At last, on June 28 at noon, the shadow of Scartaris fell on the middle of the 3 chimneys. They tied a long rope to the edge of the chimney and descended carefully. The professor has been examining the rocks as they descended. They prove the center of the earth cannot be hot after all. They entered a small passage that led off to the right. They used torches to light their way. When Sneffels had last erupted in 1229, the lava had flowed through this passage. Now it had frozen and formed strange shapes. It was like walking through a box of jewels. When they stopped for the night, they were in a kind of cave. There was something else that was worrying Axel. They had already used about half of their water. They entered the eastern passage, but it was blocked at the end. Then they entered the western passage. They heard a noise. It was the noise of running water of an underground river. Hans lifted his pickaxe and hit the rock. A strong jet of water burst out of the wall of rock. The water was very hot, almost boiling. They did not wait until it was cold before they drank it. It tasted better than any water Axel had ever tasted before. They drank until they were not thirsty anymore. Then, they filled their bottles. They decided to leave the hole in the wall as it was. The underground river would now run beside them as they descended. It would show them the quickest way down. Axel was in front of Hans and the professor. The torch he carried lit their way. They walked in silence, as usual. Suddenly, Axel turned around to speak to his uncle, but he was not there. Neither was Hans. Axel was alone. He had taken a wrong turning. He went back. He didn't find the water which was beside him. He had dropped his torch when he fell to the ground. He was in complete darkness when the torch was broken. At last he ran, his head hit a rock. He fell on the floor and fainted. Axel was awakened by a noise. It sounded like thunder or waves crashing on the shore of a sea. The professor told Axel to call to him again and he will calculate how far apart they are. They were 6 kilometers apart. The professor told Axel to walk down the passage. The slope was very steep. He could not stop. His head hit a sharp rock and he lost consciousness again. The professor intended to explore the sea, so Hans had cut down some of the trees and had tied them together to make a raft. They saw other plants which were much taller than they were on the surface of the earth. The professor was excited. There was a sky with white clouds. They were in a big cave. Along the shore there was a forest of trees which looked like giant umbrellas. They were giant mushrooms. They found bones of extinct animals. wind blew their raft along quickly. By the end of the next day they had traveled 145 kilometers on the Lidenbruck Sea. They tried to find out how deep the sea was. He tied a pickaxe to the end of a long rope and threw it into the sea. It did not touch the bottom. When they pulled it up, Hans pointed to teeth marks on the pickaxe. A monster had bitten into the iron of the pickaxe. At night the raft had been lifted out of the water. A huge sea monster had thrown them into the air. They saw two other sea monsters. They were coming towards them. Axel picked up his gun, but it would be useless against these creatures. They were terrified. The sea monsters did not attack them. They attacked each other. They fought fiercely. Huge waves threw the raft up and down. The fight lasted for 2 or 3 hours. The two sea monsters disappeared beneath the sea. Then the head of one of them appeared again. It twisted its long neck from left to right. It looked as if it was in great pain. It was dead. After a few hours, there was a change in the weather. Axel could see dark clouds coming towards them. Lightning flashed behind the clouds. Axel told his uncle that there was going to be a storm. Axel said that they should lower the sail and take down the mast, but the professor refused and told him to let the storm take them away. The storm hit them. The rain poured over them. The raft was thrown up in the air. Then the wind blew them forward at a great speed. When Axel woke up, the storm had stopped and the sea was calm. In front of them, they could see a shore. They had crossed the Lidenbruck Sea. They landed and rested on the shore. They set out to explore the shore. The professor found the skull of a human. It was amazing. Men had lived on the shores of the sea thousands of years ago. They came to a forest of strange trees. The forest was not green, but pale yellow, like the color of sand. The trees had no lower branches and you could see through the forest. Suddenly, Axel stopped and put his hand on his uncle's arm to warn him. Axel could see huge shapes moving about in the trees. They saw mammoths. When the professor saw them, he wanted to approach them, but Axel did not want to get any closer because they are dangerous. There was a man leaning against a tree. He was more than 3 meters tall and he had long hair. He held a long stick in his hand. He was looking after the herd of mammoths, just as a shepherd looks after his flock of sheep. They were afraid and they ran as fast as they could back to the Lidenbruck Sea. They saw the two letters AS carved on the rock at the entrance to a dark tunnel. They entered this tunnel and continued to the center of the earth. They had only traveled a few meters when they came up against a huge rock. It blocked their path, so they could not continue. Hans and Axel tried to break the rock with pickaxes, but it was too hard. Axel wanted to blow it up with gunpowder. Hans made a hole in the rock with his pickaxe. They packed the hole with gunpowder. Axel made a long fuse out of cloth. At 6 o'clock Axel was ready to light the fuse. There would be a delay of 10 minutes before the gunpowder exploded. Axel lit the fuse and returned to the raft. They counted the time on Professor's watch. After the explosion, a huge hole was opened and the sea became one big wave. It lifted them and threw them forward. The water carried them along at a frightening speed. They continued to go faster. It felt as if they were falling. They held on to each other to prevent them being thrown off the raft. They were going over a big waterfall. They were in a kind of chimney. The water was rising and taking them with it. As the water drove them upwards, it got hotter and the rocks were burning hot and the water was boiling. The rock walls seemed to be moving. The professor was very excited because they were in the middle of an active volcano. The professor thought the eruption of the volcano was their only chance of returning to the surface of the earth. It got hotter and hotter. The water under the raft boiled. Flames licked the walls of the tunnel. They were pushed up with terrific force. Axel's last memory was of Hans looking at him. His face was calm as always. There was one last explosion and then he remembered no more. When Axel opened his eyes again, Hans was holding him. He was lying on the steep mountain slope. Axel could see the sky, so he knew that they were back on the surface of the earth. Hans thought they were not in Iceland because the sun was very hot and the ground was dry. When Axel looked down the mountain, he could see tall green trees and little gardens. Below that he could see the blue waters of a sea or a lake. There were small boats on the water. They seemed to be on an island. In the distance he could see the shapes of other islands. Axel thought that they must be in Asia, the coast of India or Malaysia. They have traveled right across the world. They were in Italy. Then they went back to Hamburg.